Well, it's been a while since I've done anything as far as the YouTube portion of this whole thing I'm doing, getting your life back. If you guys don't, you can follow me on Facebook under my name, Cade Cooper. I like to write, and this whole thing started with me writing, my reality and stuff years ago. So I've certainly done some of that, but this last little while has been hard. And for me, it's one thing to be vulnerable about stuff that I have overcome, right? Even if it was my fault to begin with, it's another thing to be vulnerable about present stuff. And part of that is by design. I've talked at length about trauma bonding and how leading with your pain and trying to entrust your pain with people that, quite frankly, are in a place to be able to deal with it, doesn't always go well. But the last few weeks have been hard, and the thought of trying to produce content that's uplifting and, it's kind of funny. I've met people that have not met me until they've just seen Cade from these episodes, and then they meet me in person and they're thrown off. If you want to get an idea of my personality more so just from my videos, you can look at the podcast I did with Project Recovery with KSL, Casey Scott. If you Google that, Project Recovery, I'm on there. I found it a lot easier to just kind of be myself, but when I'm talking about these things, a lot of them thus far are fairly heavy, right? And so that's kind of how I am. But it certainly it shifted my reality to an extent doing this thing, which is fine. I digress, but my point is, I want to show more of my personality and more of what I enjoy in life, but it's been really hard these past few weeks. Well, one thing I want to talk about in the title of this episode is toxic perfectionism and selfless self-care. I shared this story in my story, and I shared it again on that podcast, but to kind of give you the roots of my toxic perfectionism, and also kind of what created an addict in me was, when I was a young guy, my brothers had a massage gun that my dad had used for his back, and I think I was 7 at the time, and they said, put it on your groin, and I ended up having an orgasm. And at the time I didn't have any sexual thoughts or anything. Well, that too much stimulation at an early age changed the neurons in my brain, and took what was a genetic predisposition for addiction and created one. Well, the other thing it did was I knew what I was doing was bad. I didn't know why it was bad, but I knew, and partly from the instruction of my brothers, that I shouldn't let my parents know. And so, when you're a guy my age and you're forming your identity, hopefully at mine you're not, and you're dealing with stuff that you feel is bad, it's one thing. But when you're 7 years old and you're doing something that you feel like is not good, it creates this shame, right? It creates this feeling of this conflict at a very young age, and not even quite understanding the conflict of everything, right? So, if you've been raised in a hyper-religious household, and I don't mean that in a bad way, right? Or even a strict household or whatever, the bar's typically set pretty high. Well, if you're raised here in Utah with the cultural expectations, it's set really high. And, I always had a hard time with trying to understand, what God expected of me, and then where I was good. Right? I think, and a lot of what I talk about, my framework is God and religion, because it's kind of the basis for how I interpret everything and how I react, right? But regardless if you believe in God or not, like I've said early on, it's not my aim to get you to believe in something you don't want to believe in, but I think some of these principles will be applicable regardless. But there's a scripture in the Book of Mormon that says, for we know we are saved by grace after all we can do. We differ a little bit from mainstream Christianity and the fact that we, certainly believe that Christ's grace, his suffering and everything saves us. There's a misconception we think our works can save us or we can save ourselves. That's not it at all. But we believe, like Christ taught in the New Testament, you need to follow him, right? There's a reason he set an example there. Well, this scripture in the Book of Mormon says we're saved by grace after all we can do. Well, I think that's a major hang-up for a lot of people, just general in life, and then specifically if you have this type of belief frame as far as divine aid or help from God, right? At what point do I do everything I can? I know some pretty incredible people that live incredible lives, but you know what? They can't ever enjoy it because they're constantly saying, I could be doing more. I could be doing more, right? Like, and in a way, it's almost saying in order to qualify for God's grace or favor or forgiveness, I have to be doing everything. Well, within the tenets of Christianity and my faith, there's only one perfect man who ever lived, right? Jesus Christ. And he just so happens to be the one that bridges that gap when we do what we can, right? He kind of makes up the gap there for us. As I've talked about this, I've talked about, my understanding of that and my progression of it, and the old me, when something went wrong, I would usually turn to God after my life became quite unmanageable because the seeds of my faith were planted early, and at some point I didn't know where else to go, right? And part of this toxic perfectionism, this thinking I have to be perfect, it parlays into what's called all or nothing thinking. And all or nothing thinking is synonymous with about every addict I know, but we go all in. And when things don't work out, we give up completely, right? So for me to, incur God's favor, that meant, in my religion, I had to do everything. And that a lot of these points, I up to that point wasn't doing much of anything. So, man, I've got to read this amount of time, pray this many times, go to the temple, do all these things. And, I set myself up for failure every time because it was not sustainable, right? And then the moment I started to slack on a couple things, I was like, dude, this is too hard. This is miserable. I don't want to do this. And the pattern would repeat itself, and eventually I'd fall, and then I'd plead to God for help again. Well, to overcome that and to overcome my fear of my standing with God was just, in large part, just learning him, getting close to him and understanding he views me, and he doesn't just view me, I am his son. And, he wants what's best for me. And through my process, I've come to be able to relinquish that fear that, I'm not going to make it to heaven, or I'm not good in God's eyes. I live very close to him, and, I have to, or I get to, or both as an addict, and I'll talk about that because, submitting my will to God is paramount to my continued recovery there. But, I've realized that there was one aspect where I have an immense amount of fear and anxiety, and it's not over things I can't control, right? When it comes to prices going up or inflation or government or all these things, they don't really affect me much. And again, my faith is my cornerstone, right? It's my foundation. Well, I think we're come down here to be tempted, and if something unpleasant happens to me that I didn't cause, that's just part of my mortal experience. And the serenity prayer is the staple of every recovery meeting at the end. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, that's been an incredibly powerful prayer for me. In a culture, in a nation, in a world that is unhinged by all the things that are going on, I have peace. I don't really worry about it because I understand no one can affect me, or nothing can affect me in so much that it's not supposed to if I'm just trying to do my best, right? And it doesn't mean I'm doing everything right, I can certainly bring on additional consequences and different things if I do boneheaded things, but for a large part I've removed a lot of that from what I do. If I'm talking religion, I think for me now, it's not as much sins of commission or blatant acts of things I do that I feel like God doesn't want me to do, but it's more sins of omission, or not giving certain things, or not submitting this way. Well, I realize when it comes to my temporal status, there's a lot of anxiety there. With different things. So, being raised, and I've talked a lot about trauma, right? And the earlier the trauma, the certain, stage it will affect the brain. And, as we have all these triggers and mental illness and addictions and stuff, in large part, it's just a coping mechanism for that trauma, right? Our brain goes into these destructive behaviors because it thinks it's, saving us from what it looks like is our additional trauma. So, when I grew up, I talked about this, but my parents, they inherited a cafe from my grandparents called Cafe Eileen, and it was in Fillmore, and it was a wonderful business. And when my grandpa passed, my dad took it over. Well, around that time, Fillmore, the freeway used to run through Fillmore. It's a small little town of at this point, 2,000 people. Well, there was a large contingent of traffic that would run through. Well, when I-15 started, they didn't run all the way through, and there was another competing restaurant that was closer to the exit. So, eventually I saw my dad, who was raised in pretty comfortable settings, start to struggle financially, and my parents weren't ready for it. And they didn't do anything wrong at all, but I remember calls to the IRS, and I remember stresses of what are we going to do. And my dad, he didn't want to show us anything, and so he just bottled everything up. Just bottled it up and would go and try to act like things were fine. And that created a lot of stress, which later created disease, which I believe ultimately took his life, because he was trying to protect his family, and it left my mom to kind of deal with stuff. And I have some habits with my dad, but she was kind of left to do the X's and O's of finances. I was the same in my marriage as my dad, and I didn't even know this, but I just did not want to know where we were at. We had money, but I catastrophized this fear, right? And my dad did the same thing. So, anyway, a few weeks ago, I've had a situation that's been an interesting part of my life for a few years, and I've shifted in how I view it and what I want out of it, and I believe it's been good. I don't believe it has. The fruits of it have been good, but at times it's caused me a lot of pain, different things. Well, about 2 years in, I feel like maybe I'm going to get some closure, in some way or form or whatever. So, anyway, the situation happened, and there's some things that just, it didn't go the way I expected, and I was let down, right? And it was tough. And the next day, so I had all the weekend to think about it, and I started to process it and feel better. So I'll talk more about addiction. I keep saying I'm going to do a series on addiction, and I will. That's probably, as far as psychology goes, what I'm the best at. But for me, the only way I know to put it in remission and to not have those addictive urges is the 12 steps. And the hallmark of the 12 steps is a belief in a higher power. And we don't push on someone a certain belief. I've worked with people who believe their higher power is, their tattoo. Well, the God I believe in speaks to men according to their language. And, at some point I believe that his true self, he'll reveal himself to anyone that honestly wants to know, and will, put aside whatever in order to know him. But I believe, and I've seen him help people, although I don't believe God was their tattoo, it's been beautiful to see that framework, because, we tried to get him to establish that belief, right? Well, if God's real, that certainly helps life, because, that's in large part why I'm not stressed and moved about all these things, things that happen within the world, because God's real, and he showed me he's real. And, he's come in and he's answered my prayers 1,000 times. And, eventually you don't believe in coincidence anymore. Well, as far as this situation, and my point here is part of what got me clean and the way I live my life, and the way I believe we're meant to live is submitting our will to God. And submission's not a very popular word nowadays, right? And there's a belief submission is not empowering. Well, when it comes to God, it's incredibly empowering. I ask for a knowledge of God's will and the strength to follow it, right? And for a long time, I woke up every morning and said, God, help me to know where to go, who to talk to, and what to say. And it was beautiful. And God doesn't answer every question of where I should go every second. He likes me to make my own decisions. But a while back, things with the situation weren't going the way I wanted to. And I got promptings at different times to leave it alone. And I didn't want to. And so I stopped saying that prayer. So I processed all this information, and then Monday I get ready and I start driving where I want to go. And man, I feel it. Don't go. I wanted to go, right? And so I do this great thing with God where I get a clear-cut answer. And when he answers me that way, I know. But I'm like, well, maybe I didn't understand that right. I ask again. Let's see how I feel, I ask again. Well, I pull off the exit and think I'm not going to go down there. And at some point, I just am like, okay, I think maybe it'll be okay with him. Well, I knew it really wouldn't be, but, I'm just going to do what I want to do. And so I went back and, engaged the situation. There's nothing bad or sinful about any of it, but it just did not go the way I wanted it to go. And I'll tell you what, like the dam broke. The dam broke. When I was coming off Xanax, I talk about it in my story. Benzodiazepines, it's kind of like liquid alcohol, right? And there's only two drugs that can kill you from withdrawing, okay? And that's alcohol and benzos, which is Klonopin, Xanax, Ativan, that family. When I was coming off that, I was coming off such large amounts, and my life was spared through a priesthood blessing, and I could feel it throughout my body. Otherwise, I was on an amount that I cold turkeyed without knowing better, right? But my fear was so terrible at that point about the second or third day into withdrawals. I basically kind of made this agreement with God. God, the only way I'll agree to stay on this earth is if you put me in a padded room and you lock all the doors, and the only interaction I can have with anyone is if someone just opens the door or a little window, puts my food in, and then shuts it. That's how terrifying that was. Any interaction would just undo me. Well, if you want to know about that story, you can look at episodes 2 through 4. I think 2 and 3 specifically, I talk about that experience and how it saved me. But I haven't felt that in quite a while. I felt it, not as much, certainly, the years coming up. But I think since I got clean, which is, I think it's around 40 months now, I haven't really felt despair. Despair is that feeling that things are unraveling. Right? That you have all these things and you're not capable of doing any of them. And, I had went through a very painful situation, and then I had knowingly done something that I knew that God had said, hey, you probably shouldn't do this. And it was like all my responsibilities and all my fears, all of a sudden, it seemed like I couldn't do it. There was just, no way I could get it done. This channel, this podcast, for example, it's always interesting. People are like, how's the podcast going? I don't know how to answer that question because I don't really have an expectation for what I want out of it. I've never felt from God I can talk about in public all the things that went into me doing this. But some of them were incredible. And I have no doubt it's what God wants me to do. And I've had certain premonitions and promises and different things that have come, right? But when someone says, how is this going? Well, it depends on what process I am. If you ask me that right after I've got a message from someone that it's been very impactful, I'll tell you it's wonderful. If you ask me right after my stance on something has offended someone, particularly someone I care about, and the relationship's been severed, I'll probably be understanding, but I'll probably be sad. If you ask me when I deal with the constant onslaught from Satan to keep me from doing what I'm doing, I'll tell you it probably feels like being in a fist fight with Satan. And it's worth it, right? But in order to get up here, like I talked about in the beginning, and put this stuff out there, it was not easy when you're literally scared of everything that's going on in your life, right? On top of that, and this is not to say my life is any harder than anyone else's. I am very busy, but pain is relative. You can't compare it, and I'm certainly not trying to paint myself as a victim here just to give you an accurate picture of my reality the last little bit. But it is my reality, and I am a single dad, and that requires quite a bit of work, right? I run a small business, and that one in particular is probably the main stress that I have there. So for me, at this point, it felt like God disappeared for a while. Now, the difference between now and back then is I know he wasn't really gone, okay? And I've gotten to the point where I don't curse God, right? Or I don't get frustrated with him when things happen. I don't believe God punishes us. I think he loves us enough to let us experience consequences. And some are wonderful experiences and some aren't too fun. Well, when we experience consequences for things that aren't good for us, we probably, hopefully, don't want to do them anymore. But I think he just allows us to experience consequences, and I was feeling the consequences of this, So I'm thinking about all these things and just getting absolutely overwhelmed, and it was terrifying to me, and I had witnesses things were okay, small ones. But in large part, I felt like the heavens were shut. Well, one beautiful thing is, I'm not running to pain, running to, the most pleasurable thing, the quickest when I'm in pain like I used to. Pornography is incredibly addicting because it's incredibly accessible. And the moment someone turns that on and looks at it, you're fully engaged and the world disappears. So it offers an instant reprieve to pain. Drugs do the same thing. Some work a lot quicker, like Xanax. Some take a lot longer, right? And so, being clean from drugs and alcohol, eventually from pornography, eventually from doing things, with women that I don't feel like God wants me to do, when I'm my will submitted to God, I don't really need all these coping mechanisms for pain. I don't need to stop the pain because I'm not in a ton of pain. I still go through hard things, but I have my peace with everything. When I take that will, then things become a lot harder, right? And in the past 2 months, I was on like 1,000 milligrams of caffeine a day. Yeah. The kids are constantly bribing me, right? And you get up to that, it's not helping you. It's not even giving you energy. You're just crashing. And I was as addicted to the mechanism of drinking it as I was anything else. So I tapered off that. I'm down to an energy drink, in the morning, probably around 200 milligrams. I think the recommended daily is around 300. So I feel a lot better there, but it forced me to feel more because it was numbing my pain to an extent. But because it was addictive, it was creating more pain in the long run. The last little while, I'm stressed about, finances, and it's not that I'm not good financially. It's just that there's a fear there, and I'll get into that of I'm not doing everything I should to stay afloat there, and I have to do a certain amount to qualify for God's grace when it comes to these temporal matters. So, there's a worry with that as well. Well, to cope with that the last few months, if you ask the people that know me, you can ask them how many Jordans I bought. Well, I was coping through spending money, and it was addictive, because in the moment I would buy something, it would feel really good. but it was completely counterproductive because what I was numbing was the stress of finances because I was not fully submitting to God, right? I wasn't having him, guide my affairs, and consequently I just didn't feel that empowerment that, hey, I have you quite as much, right? So I cut down and I stopped that. Well, as I stopped that, I've been feeling a lot more. And it's an interesting time to feel a lot more when you're single and it's going through the holidays. And, my brain, when I feel pain, my brain says you shouldn't be feeling this way. There has to be something you're doing, okay? Well, if you're not using drugs anymore, then, it has to be you're not doing enough. And we go back into this toxic perfectionism, right? I have to be doing a certain amount of things in order for God to protect me when it comes to my temporal things, right? My job, my livelihood, providing for those I love. And so I'm thinking about this. What do I need to do, right? Because it's at a very tough time. Well, it seems to be a pattern in everyone's life I've known that turns to him, that you go through periods where he doesn't feel there. And, I'll paraphrase C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters. It's a great book about this devil, and he's kind of a chief devil, and he's training his subordinate how to be a devil. And, he's talking about humankind, and he's referring to them as creatures. But, this is not verbatim, but it's paraphrased. But he says, never is our cause in more danger than when a creature looks out upon a world and a God that he feels has absolutely forsaken him and asks, why have you forsaken me, and still obeys. That's when the change happens. That's when most people falter. When we feel in love with someone, we say, I'm going to marry you and love you forever. Well, we're feeling the butterflies there. If we're excited about God, maybe we're getting baptized, I'm going to live righteously forever. Well, what do we do when we feel nothing and we fear that nothing's coming? Well, we keep our promises. That's what really matters. And I did. I stayed consistent in the things that I've done. But I felt forsaken there, right? And, as part of that, for me, this is where most of my anxiety lies in my life, and it's in procrastination. And, when we have a bunch of little things that we're not taking care of, they start to compound. And you have a situation like me, and the dam kind of breaks, and then all these things get overwhelming. Well, when it comes to pain, I try to, as my therapist would say, rub a little Jesus on it, or God, I need to do more and more. Well, I think we can use God and spirituality in a negative degree to try and, save us from pain by just trying to push ourselves to unhealthy measures when pain's part of the equation. I'm asking God a while back, help me to get organized. Help me to just get these things done. Help me to make so my truck and my house doesn't feel like World War III hit. Well, he did. He did through pain, right? But, I've got these things that stress me. I've got this thing, and, I've taken 3.5 weeks off of it. And, of course, my thoughts are, well, I've got a little momentum, and, I'm trying to help people. Well, what if I take stuff off, right? And, maybe I'll lose relevancy. And, my last episode, Comparison is the Thief of Joy, talks about basing my worth based upon the reception. Well, I don't think it's kind of a funny irony. I actually don't think there's anything ironic. I think that it was meant to be that was my least viewed episode as far as my personal content that I've had. I happen to think it's actually one of my best as well, right? So there was all that stress, and I certainly didn't feel like I could do it. And I'm trying to come up with these things and trying to shoot this, and I'm like, I don't have it in me, and I've just got these 5 or 6 things that stress me, right? Well, like I said, my confidence is strong with God. It waxes strong in the presence of God. If he was to take me this time, I have no fears over how I would be, which is a wonderful feeling, right? But when it comes to temporal matters, I start to wonder where that balance is, right? Because obviously a loving God is going to allow me to experience consequences. Well, I've got a little issue with the IRS. I don't know who doesn't, that has a small business, and it's not even a big issue, right? But because of trauma with IRS, with my parents, because I catastrophize things, what if I talk to them and they say this? I won't be able to handle that. And my brain goes to worst case scenarios. And so in order to not deal with those worst case scenarios, I just don't deal with the problem. And it floats up every once in a while and I push it away by distracting myself or something else. Well, I've got that stress. I've got scheduling for my business. December's just not a good month to do what I do. I have regular customers, so I kind of put them off for a little bit and, just make it up in January. Well, I was exhausted. I didn't have it in me to do the scheduling part. And, I'm a relations guy. I'm getting better at an organizational guy and all that stuff, but I don't enjoy it. And also consequently, and December, me going on a trip with my kids and Christmas and everything, my finances just looked a little lower than they normally were. And it wasn't anything to really be concerned about, but it freaked me out. And so, I've got that. I've got my house. I've got these different things, and they're stressing me to death. And I'm going through this very painful experience. And it was hard. And I'm promising God I'm going to stay diligent. I talked with my therapist about it. I'm like, it just feels harder in ways than it's ever been. And with my life, God has given me some promises and assurances of my future. It's relieved a lot of stress, and it's given me instruction and helps me to stay patient with certain things and in the way I should go. But, I'm like, I feel like I'm at the precipice to the next stage. And he asked me, how long was Christ in the wilderness? And I said, 40 days. He said, what happened after 40 days? Well, Satan came and tempted him. He's like, it would be sad after everything you've been through if you relented. Right? And so there's a talk I love by an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Elder Holland. It's called The Inconvenient Messiah. And it talks about the temptations that Satan used with Christ. Christ had hungered for 40 days. The first one is, hey, take these stones and make them bread. Well, he's hungry. And he's appealing to the flesh. He's taken a natural appetite and trying to get him to, one, abuse his power, but two, to satisfy it when it's not meant to be satisfied yet. And he talks a lot about sexual things, and I'm not here to lecture on sexual morality. My stances are clear, but there's no judgment for anyone who lives another way. I'm still amazed when I tell people my beliefs, they feel judged. Well, there's no judgment. I think people forget how I've lived, and I can differentiate actions from the person, but I believe very strongly in what I believe. My beliefs as far as that goes are in my episode, The Myth of Friends with Benefits. But that's the first thing, were temptations of the flesh, which I was certainly feeling, right? I wasn't giving in, but they were filling, and maybe I was just touching the stove, you know what I mean? And I've talked about, I think the quickest thing that would lead me back to pornography, and it's been a long time, is these scrolling through certain reels of TikTok. Maybe someone can teach me how to clean my feet up, but it just has women dressed in ways that are triggering, and they don't help my brain. But there's always this thought of, hey, I can just I'll go back there for just, and then I'll hurry and shut it off. Well, that's not good for me. So I could see how he was hitting me. Well, the second one, the way that Elder Holland talks is different than the way I interpret it. I thought it was tempting God, right? Takes him up to the top of a temple, says, jump off, for it's written, the angels will have charge concerning thee. Hey, Christ, see if the angels will save you. Well, in essence, the Savior's just about ready to, start his ministry. So now it's a temptation of the Spirit. How much easier will your ministry be if you know God has you? If you cheat death, if you jump down, then it won't be that hard. Then you'll know. Then when all these things happen, you'll look back and be like, I already jumped from the temple and angels saved me. There's a temptation of the Spirit to get divine assurance when it wasn't merited. I've certainly tried to get that in my life at different times, and God's like, I'm not going to tell you yet. And it's been a major struggle because my need to know can be a major problem. And a lot of faith comes from not knowing. I wrote a little piece back about Moses. Well, my belief with Moses, and the way I like to think of it is, Moses is running from the Egyptians, okay? And he hits the Red Sea. And here's two certain deaths, right? Mass genocide or a watery grave. Well, drowning's probably better than what the Egyptians had in store. So I picture him starting to walk under the water. And as it's coming up, saying, save me, God, save me, God, save me, God. And at the last second, Moses part the sea. And, he parts the sea. Well, I like to think that that's the way that God works, and the way God answers things is, when we're at that last second, I'm gonna show you what to do. Well, if Moses would have had a spiritual assurance before that, right, and wouldn't have taken that leap of faith, I don't think he would have had that experience, and it wouldn't have given him the faith to sustain himself and the Israelites when they later were 40 years in the wilderness. There's power in not knowing. And my need to having to have direction divinely on everything, or an assurance, is contrary to what my Father wants for me. Well, the third one was, I'm going to take you up to the top of the temple and offer you everything in the world. Name your price, right? And so I started to think, how Satan hits me, right? How he affects me. And I'm understanding these things, and I called my sponsor. He's in one of my episodes, Mark Miner. You want to hear an incredible story? Listen to his, from prison to peace. But with my brain again, I'm in a lot of pain. I've got to get this channel pumping again because I have these deadlines that only I've put for myself, right? And I don't even know what the deadlines are. God is not going to be able to help me unless I tackle all these things. I've got to call the IRS. I've got to do these things. Well, for years, my brain has always been like this. And when you have 5 or 6 things that are fairly big deals, or just nagging things, and you don't do them, and you don't know how to prioritize and to do them at a certain time, it's just overwhelming. And I am incredibly busy with everything I do. And I get home and I look at my house, or I look at my truck, or I get a little reminder I got to call them, or man, I've got to schedule these people, or I've got to invoice this customer, or whatever. I'm like, I never have the energy. And, sometimes when I'm home, I'm just paralyzed. Well, I talk about self-care, and I'll talk more about it in a minute, but there's a fine line between self-care and distraction. That's my favorite drug now, is distraction, anything that distracts me. When I got divorced for a long time, I would go to every party imaginable because it was a distraction. And while it was still very healing for me in ways, and the connection was very good, I couldn't be alone. One, because I wasn't living with my moral beliefs, and then 2, I was absolutely unorganized, but because I had so many things on my plate, and I just couldn't do them and didn't know how to start on them, I would just go and distract myself. Well, these things tend to compound. You don't pay your taxes, they compound. You slack in your business, you lose customers. All these things start to compound. And none of this is even compounded to an unmanageable level, but when I lose God's Spirit, when I lose the Holy Ghost, it turns situations that look great, situations that look manageable, to completely unmanageable. That peace which the Savior brings, the peace that surpasseth all understanding, is the most important thing in my life. And when I have it, when my will's submitted to His, I have that peace and nothing affects me. So I'm thinking of all these things, and I'm talking to my sponsor, I'm talking to Mark, and he says, brother, I don't think you're not doing enough. I think you're doing too much. I'm like, but I have all these things I have to do, and I have all these things, and he's like, relax with the podcast for just a week, or for a little bit. And ask God, what's the next right thing? Just the next right thing. And so this last week, for you guys that are organized, that do lists, that do everything, you're going to be like, duh. For you guys that are like me, that even the thought of creating a list when it comes to these things that you've put off forever can create enough anxiety to make you feel paralyzed, you'll understand. But I started to create this list, and it was only 6 things. And none of them require a lot of time or effort. Well, cleaning did, but now my house and car is beautiful, and I've put things in place just to keep it that way. And partly what's going to help is I'm not going to get so overwhelmed, because I want to keep, vigilant in my responsibilities and handle them when they handle them. So, but I create this list. God, what's the first thing you want me to do? What's the next right thing? And it's really been transformative for me. And not all these things are easy to deal with, because again, my brain tries to push me from dealing with stuff that I think is scary, because my brain tells me it's going to be this and you won't be able to handle it. But it's stepping in and saying, I'm just going to deal with it. I'm going to call the RS. I'm going to just schedule that appointment. Then I'll have energy to clean my house. Well, like I talked about God's grace, where am I good enough with God, right? When is He going to, support me in my weaknesses and my inadequacy? Well, the way that I live my life, I certainly don't think, because of the stress of not, organizing stuff, I was going to be hit with such a dramatic consequence that I was going to lose everything. I've already lost everything once in my life. But I was trying to figure out, look, I feel peace with you and me, where I am, what I'm doing. I want a tremendous amount of peace. But if I'm not up to date with all these things, as a natural consequence to get in line, there might be some catastrophic things that happen. Well, as I've gotten back to God, I need to get present. I need to just put these 5 or 6 things behind me. And once they're behind me, I just need to stay up to date and just do things as they come. I've started to get my peace back. And understanding at this point in my life, my power comes from being in alignment with my Heavenly Father's will. And that situation had happened on Monday, and then on Thursday or Friday, I think, I had an opportunity to revisit it, and sure enough, feeling excited, is as strong as could be. Don't revisit it. And I about started to second guess again. Oh, come on, you're not saying that. Well, I think it's fine. I remembered how severe everything was. And I don't believe God was punishing me. I believe He remembered my prayer a month and a half ago. Help me. Just get organized with this. Help me not to be so overwhelmed all the time. Help me to know what to do. I need your help. I don't know how. Well, son, let's remove my presence here for a week. Let's give you an accurate idea of how this stuff is affecting you and let you deal with all the pain and uncertainty and despair comes with feeling forsaken. And then let's show you a way to bit by bit whittle away at this. I'm grateful. I think of Job and everything Job went through. He lost everything, right? And it wasn't anything that he did. His family, his wife, his fortune, eventually his health, everything. He never charged God foolishly, but at the very end, right? The very end, the last chapter of Job, he says, I uttered because I understood not. Things too wonderful for me to understand, because I knew not. I always say, man, I'm not going to talk as much about God, but He's everything to me. And like I've said, if I neglected to share the thing which I think is by far the greatest benefit in this world, it's that you're His literal son or daughter, and that Jesus Christ has suffered for you and can turn your weaknesses into strengths and makes the difference, I would be doing a disservice. I'm grateful God loves me enough to allow me to experience consequences and certainly to create a shift. And for you guys that are like me, that get overwhelmed with everything and don't know where to start, this process has been wonderful for me. Do the next right thing. Face your fears. It isn't as bad as you say it's going to be. I'm still alive today, amazingly. But I'm still alive. I still can provide. I still can do these things. God has supported me in my inadequacy. And I feel like this last part of not understanding His grace, right? I understand it when it comes to spiritually. I understand not stressing about things that are out of my control, but understanding that temporally He will help me in my inadequacies and help me, because He doesn't just want me to do His will as far as spiritual things go and to do all this stuff too. I have a responsibility to provide, to take care of the things of this world, to raise two children and other things. And that's part of what He wants me to do. I'm grateful. I'm excited to start this and finally feel back in a space to do this again. Self-care is interesting. I have a little thing I put on Facebook, but when you ask people what are the two great commandments when it comes to Christianity, the answer is always the same, or usually, love God and love your neighbor. Well, no, it's love your neighbor as yourself. It's one of the two greatest commandments on earth, to love yourself. Well, when we're supposed to be sacrificing and doing everything to put time in to bless and help ourselves is not an easy thing to understand. Codependency, I talk a lot about codependency, but codependency is the chronic neglect of self in order to gain love, validation, or acceptance from another person. If you're chronically neglecting your responsibilities and you're numbing yourself by taking care of someone you're in a relationship, in any type of relationship, whether it's platonic or romantic, it's not a healthy relationship. But there's a numbing aspect of that. I'm lost in all your troubles, and it's chaotic, and it's up and down, but there's a numbing feeling to it because I'm not thinking about my troubles. Well, the problem is, in order to spend all my time thinking about your troubles, I'm not addressing my troubles and my life's falling apart. And if you want to understand more of codependency, you can look at my episode, You're Not Kind, You're Being Codependent. But for me, even this can become a codependent thing for me. I can look for validation, acceptance through this and through the reception stuff, or I can put too much time and stress and thoughts into this and the results and compartmentalize, and then I don't do all my things. But I've learned to take care of myself, and I'm still learning to. In recovery, they say you've got to do it for yourself. What does that mean? I hated myself. I would do it for myself. I was just going to do myself a favor and be done. I'm going to do it for my kids. I love them more than anything on earth. I understand why that didn't work, because if I didn't do it for myself, I wouldn't be there to, take care of my kids. But to do it for myself, to change for myself, to do all these things, I had to love myself. And I didn't love myself because I wasn't doing things that were very love-worthy. Some of it was, some of it wasn't. But as I started to shift and started to do the things that I thought I should be doing, I came to love myself. And if I met someone that was like me, I would like them. So taking time out to take care of yourself, not distracting yourself all the time with constant stimuli, which is available in every way, shape, and form, through social interactions, through social media, through video games, through pornography, through drugs, whatever. There is an escape every bit of the way. But finding that balance, because connection, human connection, it heals everything. God to us, connection being the strongest of that, right? The connection with the divine, but who is our Father, it heals it. But understanding that, hey, I've got to take time out to keep my stuff good. If I don't feel like I'm living up to the way I should as a person, shift it, change it, just do it. If you were disorganized like me, just make a list and get it done, right? Don't use all these things as an excuse to escape things that have to be done. Or you get caught up in this situation of numbing yourself with all these things while things continue to fall apart. So I'm grateful to, feel good enough to do this again. I have a list of, neat stories to bring on. And, for me, honestly, I just pray about who should come on. I've had a lot of people want to come on, and I don't tell people what to say. I just know who I feel prompted to bring on. They come on and they say what they're going to say, but there's some exciting things coming. I've got a lot of stuff I want to talk about here. My goal here is not to become a big deal. My goal is not to monetize. My goal is not to do these things. My goal is simply to share stuff that I've learned from some of the best professionals in the world with you, regardless of your belief, regardless of your ideology, in hopes that even if you don't agree with everything I say, even if you don't agree with anything I say, even if you can find, even if you hate everything I say, which there are people who do, even if you hate me, which there's people there, and that's totally fine too, don't blame me. Maybe you can find some parallels. Because when you've suffered in ways I have, and we've all suffered, but when I get to see my story or my pains or different things save people from having to go through something similar, or catch them in the midst of going through it, there's not a feeling like it. There's not a feeling like it. If you're new to my channel, if you like my content, if you feel like it can help, I've been doing this for 4 months now. I think I've got 18 or 19 episodes, something like that. It's, if you're watching on YouTube, you know what it is. I also stream this to audio with Spotify, with Apple Podcasts, and with Amazon. Getting Your Life Back with K. Cooper without a G. If you want to subscribe on that YouTube channel, if you have a Google account, or if you subscribe to YouTube, you'll be notified of my future content. If this helps you, if you find value in it, if you think it can help someone, please share it. I'm back in submission now. I'm not worried about this or that or where my life's headed, because I know in whom I've trusted. And He's been my strength. He's led me through the wilderness. He's filled me with His love, even to the consuming of my flesh. So thanks again for checking in. I'm looking forward to a great new year, and I hope everyone's doing good. Thanks again.